Sarah invited the worship team to submit ideas for May services around sci-fi fantasy. Boy, I was flooded with passion and ideas. Why was the invitation so compelling? For me, fantasy and sci-fi characters are often outliers, representing the part of myself that is least understood, but holds seminal space in these stories. There is power and healing in seeing the outlier, the disowned part of the self, come into awareness and triumph in new and surprising ways. As a child, I was a voracious reader, often reading literature beyond my capacity to really grasp. The key word is grasp. I was grasping for something in books that would allow my life to make sense. I would enter characters' lives deeply. My mother took Gone with the Wind away from me halfway through the read. She said I was becoming Scarlett O'Hara, with all the clandestine reading late at night by flashlight under my bed covers. She did eventually return the book to me to finish reading. Reading the fantasy literature, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis, The Chronicles of Narnia, was part of a reading appetite for other worlds that included the Greek myths, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the lives of the saints, Celtic myths, Canterbury Tales, and then there was the summer of my 13th year when I read the complete works of Shakespeare. These stories of heroes and heroines, superhumans who possess special knowledge and magic, saved my life, or at least that's what it felt like. Although most of my reading pursuits were on the fantasy side, I was introduced to Ray Bradbury my freshman year of high school with the short story, All Summer in a Day. The story takes place on the planet Venus, where it continually rains except once every 7 years for an hour, when the rains stop and the sun shines through the clouds. The setting is a classroom of young children who spitefully lock a little girl in the closet while the sun shines for the first time in her classmates' lives. This story pierced my heart, and it gave me language to feel into my teen inner emotional life. Here was a story that mirrored my pain about a girl locked away from the life-giving sun. Whether it was true or not, I felt cut off from my own life force, and I didn't have the bandwidth to create self-agency. Fantasy, sci-fi for me was the place where I could explore the dark, the unknown part of myself, and at the same time was exposed to tools and strategies to navigate and integrate these dark places into my emerging self. Although the Chronicles of Narnia were published in 1950, C.S. Lewis began writing them in 1939 against the backdrop of World War II and Hitler's march through Europe. He had literary companions, a group called Inklings that included Tolkien, who gathered in his rooms at Magdalen College, Oxford, to share their writing. These writings reflect the impending devastation of Europe and the feeling of doom, with stories that recounted the struggle between good and evil. For those of you who have not read the Chronicles of Narnia, they are a series of books that outline the mystical, magical adventures of 4 orphaned brothers and sisters. While staying with a cruel uncle, they discover a wardrobe, what we call an armoire, step inside, discover a door in the back, walk through, and enter the world of Narnia. They move through a series of travails, coming of age while exploring the places inside themselves that can go astray, all set against the struggle for good over evil. Moving through the story is the powerful spiritual presence of the lion Aslan, who ultimately sacrifices his life in the service of good. Lucy, the youngest child, understands immediately the divine essence of Aslan and declares solemnly to Aslan, "Please, you're so beautiful. You may eat me if you like. I'd sooner be eaten by you than fed by anyone else." As the children move through the storyline of the 6 books that comprise the Chronicles of Narnia, one becomes king and another goes over to the dark side. The struggle between good and evil is played out among the brothers and sisters. In case any of this sounds familiar, the Narnia books are a recasting of the Christian story, at least a version of it. Lost souls who live in a world engaged in the struggle of good versus evil, who are in need of redemption and are saved by the presence of a divine being willing to die to ensure the triumph of good. This particular Christian narrative was superimposed over the original story of Jesus of Nazareth's teachings down through the ages, particularly during the Middle Ages. The theology embedded in the Middle Age Christian narrative was, we are bad, we need to be saved, and God died so we could live. Why did this particular narrative hold such power in the 14th century? The 14th century was a destabilizing time. Perhaps it will remind us of the times we live in now. There was a minor ice age resulting in massive famines, cannibalism, and infanticide. The Holy Roman Empire was collapsing. There were hostilities between religious and civil authorities. The 100-year war was waging, not to mention the Black Plague, which killed half the population of Europe. Primitive consciousness says, if bad things are happening all around me, somehow I must have caused it and I must be bad. Enter the outliers of the Middle Ages, and that is the mystics of the 14th century. Perhaps you want to join me in the theme of Star Wars. Da 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 da. They lived through this age of destabilization, offering others an inner equilibrium through their spiritual writings and spiritual practices. Their understanding of the cosmos was radically different than the prevailing Christian story. Not only are we good, we have the capacity to be of the divine. Humanity is not engaged in a battle between good and evil, but can choose a life of peace that reflects the reconciliation of opposites. These mystics had a profound understanding of the role of sacrifice in spiritual growth. They believed that dying to inconvenience, disappointment, and suffering created new life, deeper understanding, and a deeper capacity to love. So this month, we will be exploring universal spiritual themes and principles through the landscape of fantasy sci-fi literature. Keep your eye on the outliers, those who don't fit a pattern, who aren't easily categorized. What is it that the outlier has to teach us? To identify the outlier within us and to journey with that aspect of ourselves can be lonely. That's why we need each other. We need community to encourage each other to grow in mind and spirit, to walk hand in hand as we connect with those that are different than us, and together with all our differences, heal the world.
We're going to have some readings now from the trilogy by Philip Pullman called His Dark Materials. One of the central notions in this series is dust. Throughout the books, the nature of dust is revealed. These passages are from the final book, The Amber Spyglass. It has been known from the earliest book that dust, also known as shadow particles or dark matter in our world, comes to humans as they come into adulthood, into full consciousness of their whole being. Dust is something the religious organization, the magisterium, is trying to destroy. But the heroes of the books are trying to understand and protect it, as throughout the series is revealed that dust is the animating force of the universe. When I first saw you in your Oxford, Lyra said, you said one of the reasons you became a scientist was that you wouldn't have to think about good and evil. Did you think about them when you were a nun? No, but I knew what I should think. It was whatever the church taught me to think. And when I did science, I had to think about other things altogether. So I never had to think about them for myself at all. But you do now, said Will. I think I have to, said Mary, trying to be accurate. When you stopped believing in God, he went on, did you stop believing in good and evil? No, but I stopped believing that there was a power of good and a power of evil that were outside us. And I came to believe that good and evil are names for what people do, not for what they are. All we can say is that this is a good deed because it helps someone, or that's an evil one because it hurts them. People are too complicated to have simple labels. Did you miss God? Asked Will. Yes, Mary said, terribly, and I still do. And what I miss most is the sense of being connected to the whole of the universe. I used to feel I was connected to God like that. And because he was there, I was connected to the whole of his creation. But if he's not there, then far out on the marshes, a bird called with a long, melancholy series of falling tones. Embers settled in the fire. The grass was stirring faintly with the night breeze. Will was lying on his back, eyes open to the stars. Later, as everyone else sleeps, Mary feels something out in the trees and she sets out toward them. The moon was bright and high in the sky. There was a lively wind and the great landscape was mottled with cloud shadows moving. Mary thought like the migration of some herd of unimaginable beasts. But the animals migrated for a purpose. Their movement had a meaning. These clouds were moving as the result of pure chance, the effect of utterly random events at the level of atoms and molecules. Their shadows speeding over grassland had no meaning at all. Nevertheless, they looked as if they did. They looked tense and driven with purpose. The whole night did. Mary felt it too, except that she didn't know what that purpose was. But unlike her, the clouds seemed to know what they were doing and why. And the wind knew, and the grass knew. The entire world was alive and conscious. The cloud shadows had things to say, and she couldn't hear them. She hurried toward her tree, moved by the excitement of the night and desperate to join in. This was the very thing she told Will about when he asked if she missed God. It was the sense that the whole universe was alive and that everything was connected to everything else by threads of meaning. When she'd been a Christian, she had felt connected too. But when she left the church, she felt loose and free and light in a universe without purpose. And then had come the discovery of the shadows and her journey into another world. And now this vivid night, And it was plain that everything was throbbing with purpose and meaning, but she was cut off from it. And it was impossible to find a connection because there was no God. Mary reaches her tree and looks into the sky and finally realizes why the dust, the dark matter, the shadows matter. Dust came into being when living beings became conscious of themselves, but it needed some feedback system to reinforce it and make it safe. Without something like that, it would all vanish. Thought, imagination, feeling would all wither and blow away, leaving nothing but a brutish automatism. And that brief period when life was conscious of itself would flicker out like a candle in every one of the billions of worlds where it had burned brightly. And Mary starts back toward the village. At the summit of the slope, she looked for the last time at the dust stream, with the clouds and the wind blowing across it, and the moon standing firm in the middle. And then she saw what they were doing at last. She saw what that great and urgent purpose was. They were trying to hold back the dust flood. They were striving to put up some barriers against the terrible stream. Wind, moon, clouds, leaves, grass, all those lovely things were crying out and hurling themselves into the struggle to keep the shadow particles in this universe, which they so enriched. Matter loved dust. It didn't want to see it go. That was the meaning of this night, and it was Mary's meaning too. Had she thought there was no meaning in life, no purpose when God had gone? Yes, she had thought that. Well, there is now, she said aloud, and again, louder. There is now.
I first read Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials series in divinity school. The class was actually a children's religious literature class. We began, if I'm remembering it right, with C.S. Lewis's Narnia series. That series is so strong in its Christology, and it evinces a worldview of good versus evil, culminating with an end of days scene in which the saved and the damned are sent on long lines to their final places in heaven and hell. The Golden Compass, The Subtle Knife, and The Amber Spyglass, the three books of the Dark Materials series, are a response in many ways to Lewis's work. Where Lewis wrote eloquently in ways that made a sacrificial Christian view of God feel personal and close and intimate, Pullman does the same in ways that capture a late 20th century, seemingly atheistic desire to destroy the divine. In fact, one of the central premises of the book is that Lord Asriel, a scholar and adventurer, is on a mission to kill God, known also as the Authority. Pullman offers challenge after challenge to Christology and to traditional understandings of the sacred. Many of those can be held right up against Lewis as a mirror or a response. Both of them create worlds. Narnia is discovered through the back of a wardrobe, a fantastical other world in which the children are empowered to fight the battles against evil that they can't back home in the real world. Pullman, by contrast, creates the notion of many worlds, billions, including our own, all existing side by side, accessible only by windows created by the knife of Book 2. Pullman begins the story in a world very like our own, but one in which each person has a demon, an animal familiar, if you will, that can talk and that accompanies them everywhere, always staying close. There in this world, we meet Lyra, the heroine of the story, foretold by prophecy, who must come to understand what dust is. Dust is a sort of light unseeable by the naked eye, except in the aurora borealis, and it settles on humans when they reach puberty. The religious entity in Lyra's world, the magisterium, does not like dust. or the knowledge and sexuality that comes with adulthood. They believe dust is the evidence of original sin, and they're hunting for ways to prevent that settling of dust upon people. They exert dogmatic control in the name of the authority, labeling anything that deviates from this scripturally based understanding of dust as heresy. The magisterium believes theirs is the only world, that they are right about all things, and that humans have an inherited evilness that must be cleansed. Enter Lord Asriel, the man trying to kill the authority. In so doing, in theory, Asriel will free the humans of his world and liberate them into autonomy and understanding. Asriel is single-minded and thus indifferent in many ways to the question of the nature of dust and how it relates to the known universe and to the authority. His mission is to kill God, and he will stop at nothing to do so. In place of the hierarchy of oppressive religion, Asriel wants to create the Republic of Heaven with no God, no magisterium, no priests, no dogma. Lyra and her friends, Will and Mary Malone, both of whom are from our world, try to understand what dust is. Mary, as the reading suggested, was once a nun and has become a scholar who studies dark matter at our Oxford. In her lab at the university, Mary had already discovered that dust, or shadow particles, or dark matter, as she calls it, had a kind of responsiveness. And she comes to learn that, in fact, it has consciousness. Dust, which is everywhere, suffusing everything, is itself conscious and animates matter. It settled upon humans and other creatures in other worlds when those creatures first achieved understanding, knowledge, and consciousness. So the moment Eve bit the apple, dust, or what we might call being, entered the story of humanity. And this, Mary knows and Lyra and Will know, isn't a bad thing. Dust isn't the accumulation of original sin, as the magisterium thinks. It's the deepening of human truth, the full realization of human potential. It's meaning and being and everything wondrous and good. Without dust, sentient creatures wouldn't exist. You can see, I suspect, just how theologically and religiously relevant this book is. It is, in a funny way, its own kind of systematic theology. It's one that purports to be atheistic, purports to be humanistic, and to be clear, those are not synonymous. Humanism and atheism are not the same. As a quick reminder, atheism is the categorical denial of the existence of God. It's a disbelief in the supernatural. Humanism, however, is simply a perspective that takes human beings, rather than the divine or supernatural, as the most important focus. Humanism does stand in contrast to traditional Orthodox Christianity because humanism declares human beings as primarily good and focuses on this world and ways to optimize human lives and meet human needs. But humanism does not demand atheism. It doesn't preclude God. And so we might view Asriel as the quintessential atheist on a mission to once and for all remove the specter of an unknowable divine being from the world, determined to free all worlds from the tyranny of an absent and mercurial God. But ultimately, what Asriel and the others do, as my colleague, the Reverend Dan Schatz points out, is, quote, free an ancient figurehead from a crystalline prison, allowing the atoms of his existence to reunite joyfully with the rest of the universe. The authority, we learn, was once a beneficent being that is now beholden to the hierarchy, the magisterium that has grown up around it, creating a barrier between what is truly joyful, heavenly, holy, and divine. The authority, God, is not the magisterium and its far-reaching dogmatic and oppressive hierarchy. But nor is the authority the one and only holiness to be found. The books might kill God, some very particular sort of anthropomorphic God, a theistic or deistic God, but they don't kill wonder. They don't kill being with a capital B. They don't kill the sacred that exists without and within, created by and sustained by creation itself. In the end, in truth, Pullman's books evince a sort of humanist theology that prioritizes living, being, here and now, and the inevitable but not yet determined process of unfolding. And there's a name for this kind of theology that admits space for something holy that some of us might term God, but that we might also call love, creation, animation, spirit, even perhaps Gaia. That term is process theology. Alfred White Northhead, the sort of grandfather of process theology, was a British mathematician and philosopher. While Whitehead's philosophical work laid the ground for a theology of change and process and unfolding, one that includes a vision of God as also evolving, Whitehead also wrote about religion almost in the way that Bradbury and Clark wrote about science fiction. Whitehead wrote, "Religion is the vision of something which stands beyond, behind, and within the passing flux of immediate things. Something which is real and yet waiting to be realized. Something which is a remote possibility and yet the greatest of present facts. Something that gives meaning to all that passes and yet eludes all apprehension. Something whose possession is the final good and yet is beyond all reach. Something which is the ultimate ideal and the hopeless quest." For Whitehead, religion wasn't necessarily good or bad, but had the potential as all things do. And he understood life and being to be a series of experiences, unfolding and creating life itself. God factored in for Whitehead as an agent of these experiential unfoldings. God is the organ of novelty, he wrote. Others picked up on this notion, particularly theologians out of the divinity school at the University of Chicago, and process theology was born. Process theology holds that just as we change and the world changes and history progresses, so too does God. As the Unitarian Universalist minister John Burens has said, God is relational creativity, the force of creation and process, the reality and wonder of unfolding. It is in the process of being and becoming that we find God. In Pullman's book, dust is joyful, conscious, animating, a force of wholeness and knowledge and creation and goodness. Dust, we might say, is the God of process theology. Pullman leaves us with a world with many, many worlds, suffused by that joyful kind of being, freed from the shackles of a greed-driven hierarchy. Reverend Dan Schatz writes, "In Pullman's Republic of Heaven, monarchy and authoritarianism have no place. Holiness and divinity are not limited to one particular faith or figure or religious authority, but can be enjoyed equally by every person, every animal, every being, every atom of the universe. In a truly democratic cosmos, reality sings with a joy unparalleled." Reverend Schatz continues, "Matter loves matter," writes Pullman. "We, made up of matter which has become aware of itself, are no less or more than the stuff of stars." In the reading we heard, Mary Malone, who lost her religion, finally realizes this. In that scene under the trees, she realizes that matter loves dust, wants it, wants to save it, wants to be in relationship with it. She realizes that dust, this stuff that only certain beings can perceive, but that lingers on us all, dust inside us and swirling all around us, is the thing that connects us. The particles of existence that hold us all, the space between. She thought that once God was dead, at first just dead to her own experience, and then dead in truth in the context of the story, that there would be no connection, nothing meaningful or holy or special. But she comes to realize that the shared endeavor of being, the energy of life, the force of creation that resulted in the entire universe and in each of our lives. That is the connection. That is something worth living for. That is meaning and truth and true divinity. And Pullman brings us there through storytelling. In one of the end moments of the books, when folks who've been trapped in an afterlife type place come through one of the windows into another world, one tells the physicist Mary Malone to tell stories. The message from beyond life is to tell stories, because stories help us live. They help us learn and know and build and create and thrive. This earth and this moment are what we have, but telling the stories of our past and imagining what might yet be, or even what will never be, or maybe in some other world could be. This capacity to use memory and weave fantasy, it is fundamentally and uniquely human, at least in our current understanding. And to use that capacity is to become ever more human. Fact and science are not enough. We need stories and awe with them. My colleague, Reverend Schatz, writes, "These books are a love poem to the spirit. They are a vision of a universe defined by interconnectedness, ethical responsibility, and above all, human compassion." I think Dan is right. Pullman kills the God of the past and tries to throw the term out along with the figurehead, but in practice, he retains the spirit, the God of the spirit. That thing that sociologists of religion like Durkheim and James and Emerson and so many others have tried to explain for centuries, that inexplicable feeling that there is something transcendent beyond us humans, something in which we partake, something that both creates us and that we create. Ineffable, perhaps, but known in glimpses through experience. Unspeakable, perhaps, but real nonetheless. That possibility, the unknown within and beyond. That, for me, is God. And Pullman leaves it there for us in this narrative epic tale of theology and philosophy. He leaves us shadow and dust and spirit and hope and joy. Every once in a while, when I walk outside, I get a deep sense of belonging, of rightness and connection. The world seems in stark relief, edges more crisp, colors more bright, a sort of electric feeling pervades the air. In these moments, I feel myself in relationship with all existence, suffused by the energy of creation and being. In these moments, I know myself to be made of dust, of star stuff, and I know that all is made of the same. In these moments, I know what I call God. And I also know my understanding of God in conversations with you, in cuddles with my children, in shared humor, in stories that transport, and in the works of human minds and hearts and hands. May we each come to know dust, God, what is within and without in our own ways, cultivating a deeper relationship with ourselves, this earth, each other, and our future. So may it be.